What's architecture really about? Archispeak is a show that dares to peek under the architectural kimono, exposing what architecture really is, what it is that architects really do, and show you why we are passionate about our chosen profession. I'm Evan Troxel. Join Neil Pan, Cormac Phelan, and me as we have a casual conversation about all things architecture, which includes all the stuff people don't talk about. Think you already know what architecture is really about? Tune in to find out. Today we're talking about deadlines. It's time for some Archispeak. We wanted to make an architecture of atmosphere. This proposal was a reaction to the oversaturation of emergent technologies in recent national and world expositions, which has been feeding our insatiable appetite for visual stimulation with an ever greater digital virtuosity. High definition, in our opinion, has become the new orthodoxy.
That quote comes from Liz Diller, and she was speaking specifically about the Hirshhorn Gallery temporary edition that they're doing, which has been labeled the Bloomberg Bubble, or even nicknamed the Diller Dome. And what she was speaking about was how we're using public space and how public space is perceived both in just the built environment, but also how public space is perceived in the digital age. And I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts or input on that, but let's open it up for some discussion there, guys.
Well, I think that the interesting thing about the way that she was saying that was that she was reading it, and because I think it would be difficult to pull all that out on the fly, but that's Archispeak at its root right there, and it kind of leaves everybody a little bit dumbfounded hearing it. But I think if you study it, it actually does make sense. But it's one of those things where you really have to take it word for word and break it down to see what it really means.
I think some of the people that probably were in attendance at the TED Talk were a little more layman, but for the most part, these were practitioners, academics, and things like that typically speak like that, or at least, in their dialogue back and forth with each other through presentations and, books and stuff like that. That's how the actual orthodoxy or the idea is conveyed back and forth. And but my thought is that the poor layman that's sitting in there, and as she's going through the speech, which was a fantastic speech about a very interesting project, and being a DC local, I'm actually quite excited to go and experience the space when it occurs, because in fact, after this podcast, we're probably going to be heading to downtown, and one of our favorite museums to go to is the Hirshhorn. But
really nice,
yeah. But it's the the way that she was trying to convey the idea, especially as you're trying to present it. Now this was a TED Talk that was presented to academics and professionals alike. It wasn't presented to the people of DC to try to convince them that this is a really good project, because the link that I sent you guys yesterday about this particular TED Talk and the overabundance of Archispeak was really it came from a link to the DC daily paper, and or it's called the Washington City paper, and we can provide a link to that, to both the article and that particular TED Talk we're referring to. But it was, if you read the article that accompanied the link, the article was pretty plain spoken. It was just telling people exactly what the project is, why there's possible delays, why it may not open, or things like that, But when, you sit down there and you listen to it as a Washington City paper reader, you're not quite sure what she's actually trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it is something that has to be dissected.
I think it's a good example of our tagline in our Twitter feed, which is large made-up words that architects and designers use to make themselves sound smarter than you.
Yeah. She comes
Right.
across as a very intelligent person. I would have to say that.
Yeah,
But I don't know her personally.
and let's not make it as if we're, criticizing her or anything like that, because again, I admire a lot of the work that they do, and I admire, just the simple fact that she could stand up in front of thousands of people and give this speech regardless of, what the content or what words were coming out of her mouth. I mean, I for one have, quite a disdain for standing up in front of people and giving presentations, though I do it often. But I just think it's the way that, a lot of times we tend to come across, sometimes we do ourselves a disservice sometimes, and that I think is more what we're talking about, is that, I often say in the studio, architecture is not as hard as we make it out to be. Architecture is actually, well, for the trained, it's an easy profession, especially for the the people who, as we talked about last week, it's a labor of love. And then when you love something as much as we all do about our profession and in our chosen life, I mean, it gets to be pretty easy. But when we're trying to convey what we're doing to just the general public, sometimes we go a little overboard and give ourselves the overabundance of Archispeak.
Yeah, and do you think that a little bit stems from, the general feeling is that architects are not regarded how they should be, for the amount of work that we have to put in to get our licenses, to get our degrees, to practice, and then all of the liabilities and things that come along with that. I think the general feeling is that architects don't feel like they have the eye of the public like they should, and so maybe that's like overcompensating for that a little bit.
It could be, because we tend to put ourselves in the same professional category as doctors and lawyers, both with the education that we, usually 5 to 6 years, unless you go on to a doctorate degree, and then our licensing and, the minimum of 3 years internship, sometimes even up to 10, depending on your degree. And yeah, I think we put a lot of effort into becoming, the architects and design professionals that we are. But, and yeah, so I think we kind of feel slighted because, we tend to come out of college, and, this goes to, some of the comments that we were, receiving on our, on last week's podcast. But we don't really come out of college making as much money as our professional counterparts do. And so we kind of feel a little slighted. And so, yeah, I think it's our way of kind of saying, and I don't want to sound like I'm belittling, my fellow architects, including myself, but, we kind of like, look at me, I really am important. And, I think we do that unnecessarily because we are important. And, we do provide a service that, really everybody needs.
Yeah. I think that for the most part, I think the general public does regard architects pretty highly. I think that's true. As we see them portrayed sometimes on TVs and movies, they are portrayed, rather high and rather respected. I think it's just within the industry, our construction industry, that sometimes we're just seen as a necessary evil. I got to have this architect to draw this up and get this done.
Well, I think part of the issue is not, because I would almost venture to say that the general public, architecture is for most people an invisible profession, because we provide a service and not a product. For the most part, the building industry is seen more as the contractors who actually deliver the keys to the building, to the thing, and so that's why I kind of tend to think that we're kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people, and so that's probably where some of that stems from, of us feeling like we've lost some importance in it, and it's our own fault.
Totally, because I mean, back in the day, back when we had the Cons, and I'm not talking about Lou, I'm more talking about Albert and, Wright and people like that, we were master builders. One of the comments that I really kind of gravitated towards is how we've basically through, basically litigation and liabilities have let ourselves be separated from the term master builders where we used to be. I'm sure you guys have all seen the way that drawings used to be back in the day, where you could build Unity Temple or something with four sheets of drawings.
Yeah.
And that Frank Lloyd Wright was out there directing every day exactly how he wanted it to be built. Whereas I just issued a set of drawings for probably something square footage wise, the same size, if not a little bit larger than a Unity Temple, that had over 300 sheets just of drawings alone. And that's not including the technical specifications that, are all part of the contract documents.
And that's because of this complete disjointedness between architecture and construction, right? Because we don't trust the contractor to build it the way we've told them, because we know that they want to cut the corners and make as much money as they can. For the most part, I'm totally generalizing here, but we have to overcompensate with the drawings now to be able to do that. Right. Yeah. And then we also have to overcompensate with the drawings to COA, right, to cover our butts when it comes to litigation, because there is so much litigation in this industry.
Well, and an example of that, back when I was not long after school, we used to take the engineering markups and do those on our drawings, on our architectural drawings. So the sheets would essentially be drafted by us, by the architect. And after some litigation, that essentially was the engineer's fault in this case, but because we had drafted it and it was on our title block as the architects, we were pulled into that lawsuit and found liable. And after that, it was like, okay, no, Mr. Engineer, you have to provide your own drawings on your own title block, and we don't touch it anymore. And that was, it was a smart move at the time to protect ourselves, but continued the process of moving us away from being totally involved in the construction process and the built environment.
Well, yeah, it's that sense of giving away the goods, because we talk about, and this is definitely something that is future chat for us, because we've had several of our architecture friends, and also through the comments and stuff, have talked about, oh, you guys need to talk about the architect's role through construction administration, which for me is probably as important of a role, if not more, in my day-to-day life, as it seems like it is to other people. So I really want to delve into that a little bit later. But you're right. I mean, essentially what we're doing is creating a set of documents that is the cover your butt. A sense of, let's try to stay out of litigation as much as possible. So let's have this built-in redundancy in our drawings that, if it's not here, it's going to be here, 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 and here, so they can't tell me that door isn't covered, and right. You're just like, wow, that's a little too much.
And even I think the whole construction administration, even down to my level when I'm doing remodels, is important, because as an example, my project that's under construction right now, I wasn't hired to do any CA and wasn't consulted on anything. And the stucco guy decided that he wanted to do different trims on the house. So he changed the trims. And then the client didn't consult with me, or didn't want my input on color selection or anything like that. And so they chose a color that is not necessarily the most, what would maybe bring this house and carry it off well. And so here we started with a really interesting project. And then because I wasn't able to be involved in the construction administration process, it's turning out to be something a little different than I think that I hoped for, and hopefully what the client was expecting. Now, they're making these decisions, so I guess they're happy with it. But that's where the best intentions of a good design really falls down, because the architect wasn't involved through that process.
Yeah, and it's their prerogative, which is, that's a really hard thing for us to deal with, and that, make no bones about it. As a designer myself, that's one of the toughest things. But I would say that, it's their money. It's probably the most money they've ever spent in their life, and it needs to be what they want. And honestly, if we don't want that to happen, then, because I think we'd probably all agree at one time or another, clients are the worst, right? So don't have a client. And one of the comments on our site was, take a look at what Jonathan Siegel's doing down in San Diego, and he's doing some amazing architect developer work, and he is his own client. And that's honestly, if people won't stop talking about how clients are the worst, if they want to stop talking about that, they need to become their own clients, and they need to retake the role of design, build, delivery into their own hands and take all that risk and do it themselves. And that guy is doing some amazing work, and I've looked into his courses that he offers, and it's cool stuff. And he's doing big commercial projects now. But he also assumes all that risk, and he's running the show from drawing to keys at the end.
And that's what maybe we need to get back to a little bit.
I would love
this
to.
Entire profession, because if we don't, I mean, the onset of BIM, and we will probably get into that in a little more in depth in another episode. But the whole concept is one where on larger buildings, where the architect is just being completely taken out of the equation to a certain extent. You've got the larger construction firms kind of being the BIM master, and we're just a piece of that. And if we're not careful, we're going to get completely cut out of the process. We'll become irrelevant.
Yeah, but I think in a way though, I don't know if I want to say you guys are like kind of giving up the farm, but if you aren't able to do the architect as developer or, spec homing and things like that, what you need to do is ensure that that particular service is conveyed to the client as probably the most important phase of the whole design process, as the actual sitting down and drawing the pretty pictures or the construction documents that, to administer this properly.
Right.
You need to actually be involved throughout the whole process and be there for construction administration.
And involve the client in that entire process.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The school project that I have right now with the basically connecting two existing historic buildings together. I'm probably more involved than the construction manager in trying to ensure that the day-to-day scheduling of both the trades that the CM is supposed to schedule. I'm equally valuable in that process of keeping it moving and keeping it going, because of I guess in a way in this particular case, it's the complexity of the, the historic component and how we're connecting these new buildings and all the different unforeseen conditions and stuff like that. But, it was interesting that, as we were leaving the site, my project architect, who's a recent graduate, she was walking off the site and she's like, wow, I didn't realize that there was so much management in architecture. And there is. That's essentially all we really are, whether it's the management of the design, the management of the documents, management of the contracts. We are the managers of this particular project. And once we allow ourselves or, don't convey to the client that, that particular management, administration is taken out, if we can't convey to them that they need us, then, we end up with the stucco guy changing the trims and, changing the colors and things like that, and getting away from the design as it was seen. And even in the case where it's like, well, we made this change because it was more cost effective. Well, you can make that change as more cost effective, but if you allowed me, access to that process, then I would say I could have told you that we could keep this detail or this design or this color or whatever, and still save you money by basically just reassessing the way we were doing something. And those are the things that I, because you guys will, hear this preached, on and on and on about, construction administration, because that's one of my favorite subjects.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, and maybe in future projects for myself, it's more of a communication problem for me to communicate to the client that not only am I essential. I mean, you're talking to me in the first place because you think you need a design professional
exactly.
to help you, and for me to communicate. Not only am I important here, but I'm important towards the end at the process through the construction and as your resource. Not only just for the design and the construction drawings and the permitting process, but the construction process as well. And I think for smaller remodels, sometimes kitchens and small additions, that sometimes that's lost because the client begins to figure out what they think they need, and yet they then go and make some decisions that maybe are not in their best interest, or that they, because they're looking maybe at one thing and they're not looking at the whole. And because you're designing the whole product, that you really need to be involved in that. And so really it's a communication to let them know that this part is just as important as the beginning, and there's not an option here. You can't just cut out construction administration and save a few $100s or a few $1,000s here in my portion of the contract, because there's value there. And that value needs to be carried through from beginning to end, or to, like you just said, Evan, to here deliver the keys. Yeah. We're done. So,
well, this is cool stuff. I wanted to take a second here and thank everybody who did comment on our first episode. We were pretty blown away, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
And so just so everybody knows where the comments are is if you go to archispeakpodcast.com and if you click on the episodes link at the top, that's where the list of our episodes is. And under each episode, there are comments. And so a couple of really thought-provoking comments, one by Asan, who is a former student of mine at Cal Poly. And thank you so much for that comment. I think all of these are worth reading if you guys want to go back and catch up so that you can follow along with us. Those comments are gold. Ken Munson is the guy who was talking about Jonathan Siegel. And then we just had some really good comments on there, and so we really appreciate it, and we love how the conversation continues throughout the weeks as we're working on this.
And absolutely, and don't forget our Twitter feed as well. You can always reach us there, and that's Archispeak, which is ARCHISPK, and follow us there on Twitter, and that's another good way.
Yeah, because the dialogue definitely is, something that we like, the interaction, both through comments and through Twitter banter, because that actually helps us, think about what's the next thing to talk about, and just let us know that everybody else is kind of feeling the same way we are.
Yeah, and please comment. We would love to know what you want to hear about. We'd also love to know what you think about what was said. And when we're going through these as well, if there's things that we bring up, like the TED Talks that we started off with, I'm going to put links to those in the show notes. And so if you guys go to the page for the episode, that's where you can find links to the things that we're talking about during the episode.
And don't forget, we appreciate all the comments as well on iTunes as well. That's big plus, and that really helps the podcast reach.
Yeah. So if you guys can tell other people about the show, and we'd love to get more comments on iTunes about how we're doing.
Well, that brings up this week we wanted to touch on something that we deal with, that's Cormac's life, apparently, is deadlines. How he lives his life.
It's how I live my life too. I will say.
As I say, I don't really live in linear time in the same way of, oh, it's 11 o'clock. It's, it's 3 days from my next deadline or my next milestone or my next submission deadline. So yeah.
Yeah. And for those of you who are in school, I mean, school is deadlines too, right? I was in the quarter system, 10-week quarters. You got 5 weeks till midterm. You've got a test here. You've got a test there. You've got a big project due at the end. It only gets worse when you get into the profession. It's absolutely true.
But the better part is you're actually being paid for it, so you can actually afford the beer.
Really?
I don't know. Were you being paid to sit in design studio half the night? I wasn't. No, but actually that brings up something I wanted to talk about for to start this conversation off on that, which also applies very well to all the students is, take whatever time estimate you think it's going to take you to do whatever task it might be and just multiply by 3, because that's the time it'll actually take you to get it done.
Yeah, that's pretty realistic. I've always heard 𝑥2 and it never works out. So
no, it never does.
Go to the next level. Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually heard the ×3, and what that actually, the talk about the deadlines and the time management, speaks to what we were already talking about, earlier in the podcast about, management of things and building that extra time into something, if you're able to, with these, I need this done now, or I need to get this at that time kind of mentality that we live in. What it does is it gives you time to double check things, go over things, make sure you've crossed your, T's and dotted your I's to ensure that everything's there, so that some of the pitfalls of construction management and things like that, don't really happen, and that, your that the deadlines can be met, and that, things that do become a little bit more realistic. It was interesting. I was reading a couple of comments, and I even went back to a couple of the comments on some of the things that Bob's posted on his site, and how students, they're starting to get scared. It's like, oh my God, I didn't really realize that the profession was like this, and I don't necessarily think that we're trying to scare anybody away. We just want to really, for the student listeners, really prepare them for, the actuality of the profession, because, even that comment that, my project architect made, she's like, I didn't realize that there was so much management in architecture. These are things that school doesn't really necessarily prepare us for, in that we really, laying it out on the line like we do kind of lets people know that, there's a lot more than people are telling you about architecture. Not all good, not all bad, but it's just part of the life.
It's really complex, I think, what you're talking about is time management, being able to manage your time and what you do, but then also coordinate that across all these different disciplines, and it really is complex, and so you have to get good at complexity.
Exactly. Think about, the architect as juggler. It's because not only do you have just probably a single project that you're working on, that you're not only doing the design work or administering things, but you're also doing something that's under construction, so you're juggling it there, and then you're thinking, when you sit back and you're like, oh my God, I've got this deadline coming up, and how do I actually achieve it when I've got all this other stuff going on, and through management we actually tend to do that. So Neil, let's start hearing some of those, the hot buttons, because I know this is something that's definitely near and dear to your heart.
Well, I have, one of the things is when you talk about deadlines, in Cormac, you just mentioned it. How often does it happen that the deadline is met, but all of the things that you just said about checking the drawings, dotting the I's and crossing the T's and coordinating with the consultants, how much of that doesn't often happen because you're scrambling just to get the drawings done to hit the deadline, and all of that other stuff doesn't happen. That's certainly very frustrating and something that falls into the time management, but sometimes that just goes away and doesn't happen.
Yeah,
we'll do it while it's in plan check. That's always a fun one.
As complete opposition to the whole deadlines argument is what goes around in my little circle is it takes whatever it takes to get it done. It just takes as long as it takes.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so
one key. Yeah, I was going to say one thing that, especially as a student, if you're a student listening, this probably applies maybe a little bit more because you're spending time doing mostly design for your projects. But even in the profession, that this is true too. But one key to hitting a deadline is knowing when to stop designing. It's like yes. I have to get my drawings done and whatever else for my presentation ready. You have to know when it's time to stop designing and finish a project, and that's as much of a key when you're an architect or wanting to become one, and probably in a lot of different professions as well, is when to stop and move forward so that you can get your deadline.
And and sometimes it's equally as important as convincing the client that it's time to stop designing and move on to the next phase.
Yeah, that's hard.
Well, rather than, I don't necessarily think that we're giving them, the negatives of all of this, but, what are some of the things that you guys do to handle deadlines? I know, that I've got my own, kind of, tedious, almost checklist process that I have for how I go about each project as it goes through the schematic design phase all the way through permitting on into CA, and then I've got a different set of rules that I have set for myself on how I manage stuff like that. But I'd be interested to hear how you guys deal with your typical deadlines, and it most likely we're probably on the same sheet of things.
Well, from my experience, because I'm usually early in on the whole process for the building, and so there's several, there's all these user group meetings, there's, discovery period where you're trying to figure out exactly what the problem is before you can solve it, and then you go into design, and then you've got schematic design due, and then design development, and multiple schemes, and there's all of these things that, like you said, architect is juggler, right? You're trying to figure out the path that this thing's going to take, and it's a truly organic, nonlinear process that lives within a very linear world of schedule. And the number one thing that I can say that you need to hit a deadline is absolute commitment. And I know that people are going to say, show me the checklist, tell me what project management software you use. Honestly, I don't think any of that stuff matters. What matters is your ability to get in the zone and be fully committed to the project until it's done. And I can honestly tell you that I did not do one all-nighter when I was in school, and I've done more now that I'm out. But we should never have to do that. We should be so good managing our own time that we don't have to do that. Otherwise, it's just and it often is, a very unrealistic deadline.
Right. Well, we had this saying when I was in the Army, and honestly, it's carried over to this profession. And as ridiculous as this sounds, it's prior planning prevents piss poor performance. And what that's meant to me in the profession is, and Evan, you've got this as well. Working with public schools know when they're going to have funding, when they are going to be able to start construction, and when they need that construction to end.
Yeah.
So what that does is that tells me that understanding the process to get to the point of they want to start construction at the, right at the summer of the end of a particular school year. Say, for instance, I've got a project that's actually going to start at the end of this school year. So what I did was, rewind back to when we were awarded the project and said, okay, they want to start construction in June of 13. They want to be done with the construction no later than August of 15. And how do I go about, orchestrating the whole, ensemble of engineers and surveys, testings, and all that other stuff. And so what I ended up doing, what I typically do for, approaching my deadlines is, cartooning it out. Sit down with a schedule of what it's going to take for me to get to, the permits and everything else ready to go, bid and everything at June of 13. Sit down with a calendar and go through and say, okay, here's where I establish my deadlines, through schematic design. For me to make my deadlines, I've got to be done with schematic design here. I've got to be done with design development here. I've got to have sign off and ready to go with my construction documents so that, I will hit my permit date and submit for permits. I know that permits typically take, 3 to 6 months depending on the jurisdiction that I'm dealing with. So, I need to at least have my permit set here. And then, with working with school systems, which is the bulk of the work that, the firm I work with does, we've got state submissions for funding and things like that we've got to hit. And, it's just this layer upon layer of things. And, it's back to that juggling it to make sure that we can, detail it out. So, just like if you're, mapping out a comic book, which I currently seem to be doing, it's cartooning it out and seeing the process in my head. And then, as you said, Evan, just, bearing down and getting it done because I know what I have to do.
Yeah.
I think cartooning is a good metaphor to use because trying to cartoon out a set and just understand what drawings you need to do.
Right.
And this can apply even in school. If you're doing a design project and you get to during the early part of the process, you have to determine what are your deliverables essentially going to be. And you can use that information to kind of figure out, okay, how many hours is it going to take and how many people am I going to need to do it? Because I know one of the challenges is when doing a project is you can't just throw bodies at it towards the end and try and make up time. That rarely works and it is tough to do. So unless you're in a small office, maybe 2 or 3 people, then everybody can jump in and try and slam something out in the last few days. But in most firms and most types of projects, that doesn't work very well. So cartooning out a set, knowing what your deliverables are, going back and, like Cormac said, having that schedule laid out, and you could even almost do that in school. But I think one of the interesting things about laying out your schedule is that when the client makes changes or the municipality changes something and there's additional work added or maybe even taken away, one key is to make sure you keep updating that schedule throughout the process. And if something changes, to modify that schedule, communication with the client, communication with the office, the team to know, okay, well, we just made this change. How much longer is it going to take us to do this? Or what time, how does that affect the schedule and the budget? And you've got to really go back to the client and let them know, especially if it's something coming from them, that, okay, this is going to take us 2 more weeks. Well, there's money involved here. And, whether or not you can get paid for it, but certainly having your client understand the schedule. I know when I'm talking to clients, and I try and be very broad with the schedule on a remodel, okay, 1 month here, 1 month for this, 1 month for that. You'll be about here by this point, to give them the perspective as well, so that you don't get unrealistic deadlines or deadlines that your client is expecting and that it just honestly can't happen. If they're expecting, okay, submit for permit and 5 days later they have a permit in hand, well, sometimes that can happen, but not likely to happen. So you have to really set that expectation for your client as well as your office and your project team, so that everybody knows what the schedule is. And, if there's changes, it's vital to let everybody know what effect is that going to have. Because otherwise everybody's just working in the dark.
Yep. So have you guys noticed this? I'm sure you have. The closer the deadline gets to actuality, the harder everybody works, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that that is a total 4 or 5 podcast discussion about architects as a procrastinator and how we've mastered the art of procrastination. And I don't necessarily think it's, in the way of, we intended to just kind of like, wait and then do it. It's just, we're like, well, this one, that deadline is, 6 months out, but I've got this, and this. So you're spending so much time and effort on the tasks that need immediate attention that, Mr. 6 months away now is 2 months away. And you're like, oh, crap. Yep.
Well, that's why I think it's important to break down some of those bigger timelines. If it's 6 months out, you really need to break that down into several weeks or months of chunks, so that you get these little mini deadlines, so that you can kind of keep off Mr. Procrastination and stay on track as best you can, because nobody likes that end. And Evan, you mentioned overnight or all-nighters, and I think I did one in college because I wanted to see what it was like. and I never did it again because I was a complete zombie the next day.
Yeah.
And in fact, I even had a second-year design professor who was also a architectural history professor. He told us in his history class one time, he said, I don't want you guys, or I think it was in design lab, he's like, I don't want you guys pulling all-nighters. Don't do it in my class. He said, go home, get at least 4 hours a night, because otherwise you've wasted a day, or maybe 2, and they're just not worth it. So anyone in college, I'm telling you now, go home, get your 4 hours of sleep. Honestly, what I did, and this worked really well for me, is I would leave lab at, 5, 6 in the afternoon. I'd come home, I'd eat dinner, and I would take a short nap. Maybe it was 15 minutes or an hour. And I'd get back up at 8, 8:30, 9 o'clock, head back to class, and would work in lab from 9 to, say, midnight, 1 o'clock, 3-4 more hours on my project. And then I'd go home and get 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and then come back the next morning at 8 and hit it again.
So you're saying that you didn't move a sleeper sofa into the studio like I did?
You didn't sleep under the drafting table?
No.
Yeah,
I didn't. I tried to maintain some semblance of real life. And maybe that had something to do with, I spent 3 years in junior college. So by the time I hit Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, where I graduated from, I was already, 21, 22 years old. So I wasn't the 18-year-old kid coming out of high school that kind of did some crazy things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can honestly say that, it is all about planning it out ahead of time and having a full commitment from everybody on your team, because I have to say, a couple of the times that I've had to stay overnight, it wasn't because of my schedule. It was because I had to pick up the slack of somebody else. Mm-hmm. And that is just disgruntling, that it doesn't make anything good. And it's not a safe thing either. What you're talking about, Neil, when you're a zombie the next day, your attitude is going to be well known amongst everybody around you. If you have to drive, it's going to be a dangerous thing. I mean, when I was in school, I know people who drove off the road because they fell asleep in their car.
Wow.
Drove into the center divider on the freeway, spun around in a rainstorm because they fell asleep. I mean, that happened, once a quarter. There was somebody getting in a major accident because they just weren't sleeping, and it's not good for anybody. So you're right. You've got to get some sleep. And if you're not going to finish, then maybe you have to pick your points where in the project where maybe someone isn't going to look so hard, and you focus on the stuff where they are going to look,
Or, and then that also, leads into the, if you're not going to finish, it's okay to be truthful and honest with your client and let them know that, but let them know in advance in enough time so that they can actually react and say, okay, well, because if you're running to the end of the deadline, as we're, mentioning that everybody seems to, kind of wait to the very last minute. But let your clients know that, hey, this is going to actually take, another 2-3 weeks, but we want to make sure that it happens. It's that open communication, and it's even an open communication with the, your team members saying, hey, I understand that, you got to go home and see your kids and stuff. But, if you stay just a couple more hours and I stay a couple more hours, that would be better than both of us having to stay, 2 days from now all night long and not getting a chance to see anybody.
Right.
Because you're going to have all of those, disgruntled causing, frank conversations with your studio mates, saying, we've got to get this done, and when and why we have to get it done. So, it's the extra efforts.
I am often surprised when we do go in those rare circumstances to a client and say, can we have more time to accomplish this task? The answer is almost always yes. Because they do get it. Especially if you've been involving them and they know how much work and how difficult it is, or how much time it's taking to get through this particular phase. They're often very understanding.
Or in that even rarer occasion when it's the client who's actually caused the changes that are now making you work a little bit longer.
So rare.
Yeah, rarely ever happens.
Yeah. Don't expect any more money for that extra time, though, Evan.
No, absolutely not.
No.
Okay, well, I want to ask you guys something, because I know when I was in college, there were lots of times where I worked, weekends, and I had friends going out, and they would go to different events or a concert, or come on, Neil, let's go do this. Guys, I can't. I got to finish this project, and I missed out on a lot of things. And maybe that was okay when I was younger. But now, with a family and everything, family's more, life is more important. I guess maybe after 20 plus years in this industry, that I've got a little bit of different perspective on life in general, I suppose. But, sometimes it just, I don't care. It's like, I don't care about the deadline. And it's like, no, I'm going to go home and I'm going to visit the family, or I'm going to go to bed. I'm not going to go back and work.
You have to give yourself permission to do that. And I think it comes down to how you want to live your life. And I totally get that. And I feel like that a lot too. It's like, well, I deserve to have a life too. I've put in my time. I get paid for that time. I'm not getting paid for all this extra time. And at some point you do have to say, I'm going to take my time. And you're right. The family is super important. And when I was in school, I did not have a life at all for 5 years. Not at all. I didn't do anything except school.
Yeah, I did a few things probably, but I think I guess maybe part of in the last almost 8 years now, my son's going to be 8 this summer. What I've come to realize is that as I notice my kids growing up so quickly, it's like,
oh, it's crazy.
Should I go into the office today, or should I take my kid to the park and let's go ride a bike?
Yeah.
Because there's only going to be so many days he's going to be 6 or 7 years old, and those are real precious moments for him.
Yep.
And I have to realize that and say, I'm sorry, I just can't do that. I can't. And that's not to say I don't work hard when I'm at work, but maybe I'll work a little bit more than my 40 hours a week. But doing 80 or 90 hours and not seeing anybody, or missing out on my son's or my kids' school play, or volunteering in their class, sometimes those things it just become more important.
Well, and if anybody wants to get a good idea of what it's like, because, I think that we all want to be the best architect we can be, right? We want the projects to be as great as they possibly can. And we always want to take what we've learned and apply it to the next one and get better and better and better. And I could easily see myself slipping into the work is the most important thing kind of a mode, above family, above everything else, because I want the work to be that good. But at the same time, I don't want to be that kind of dad. I don't want to be that kind of husband. And if anybody wants to get a really good idea of what it's like to go down that path, there's a couple of movies that you can look at on Netflix. One of them is My Father the Architect, which is the story about Louis Kahn that was made by his son. And then the other one is, I'm trying to think of the name, I think it's called My Father the Genius. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the show notes. But it's about Glenn Smalls, another architect who taught at SciArc for many years. And both of these are just heartbreaking stories by their children. They're documentaries by their children, basically showing like the work was amazing at this crazy expense, which is I never knew my father. And it is totally heartbreaking.
Well, then there's the Counterpoint movie, and it was a documentary about Calatrava. And what was interesting about that is he would totally immerse himself in these projects. And I think this was before we had children, and it was just my wife and I. We went to this. Actually, we had one child, I always have these, pie in the sky dreams. I'm going to be the next, in architecture record or this or that, my projects are going to be great. And we went and we watched this movie, and, he immersed himself in these, all of his projects. But the thing that I found most interesting about it was he actually travels with his family.
Oh, yeah,
so his family's, not too far away. And, so what was interesting about that is like my own personal experience is, yeah, I will find myself sometimes spending a boatload of hours, per week on a project. But I've got this interesting system that I do where, I take my oldest son to school every day. So I get to see him, because, especially as you said, Neil, they grow up so fast. I mean, I can't believe that I've got a 12, going on to be a teenager. How quickly he's, now, acting and, acting like the teenager that he's going to become. But I get, the opportunity to take him to school every day. So I'm in the office early every morning. And then I come home normal time, and leave the office at, 5:30 there, no later than 6. I get to, hang out and spend time with my family, eat dinner with them, do the things like, go into the comic book shop and all that other stuff, whatever, we've got going on. And then, when they go to sleep, then it's game time for me. I log in, from home, or, I only live 12 minutes away from work, or I'll, turn around and drive to work and just, work till I, basically, can't keep my eyes open anymore, and then crash out and do it all over again. But what I've done is I've, I guess in a way sacrificed my own sanity for what's important in my life, which is, my kids and my wife, and, making sure that they're as equally, tended to as my profession. So I have made, an extraordinary concerted effort to, to make the family work-life balance, pretty successful, and if it's at the sacrifice of a few hours sleep, or I don't get to watch Spartacus until it's on demand or something like that, so be it. But, I'm never going to have this God, I wish my dad was there kind of feeling when my kids grow up, because you're right, Evan, the watching My Architect was just like, wow, this kid, never really knew. I mean, he knew he was loved, but he never knew his father. But that also goes into a little bit different because his father was living a double life anyway.
Maybe even a triple life. Yeah.
True. Yes. Triple. Yeah. But yeah, and I think one of the reasons all three of us have talked about even doing this podcast was to kind of let people know that, there is the ability to have this life, this work-life balance, in that, if you consider them separate, then that's typically what's going to end up making it hurt worse, is because you're going to be dedicating your time to one thing or the other. But if if you're able to successfully merge the two together, then, it's great. And sometimes I'll just take, my boys in to work with me, and just let them hang with me, either through the day or, if I go back at night, I'll take them with me. So, they know that, yeah, Daddy's got to do some work, but work's not more important than them.
Yeah, I've done the same thing, and it's cool because it's one of those offices where there's plenty of stuff for them to mess around with.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty fun.
Well, one of the things that we haven't talked about with deadlines is when you hit that deadline, and I know when it's happened for me, you orchestrate this giant project, and you hit the deadline, you get this great feeling like you're the hero.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. It's like, yes, it's come together, and
it is a
great feeling,
yeah.
Very satisfying feeling. And so it's not all doom and gloom, as we've been kind of a little hinting at all the way through in the challenges. But when you do it successfully, at that one time in your life, you feel like a hero.
And I feel like that is one of the highest moments in the path, is when you are completely dedicated to accomplishing that goal. You've got your nose to the grindstone, and you're in that zone, and then you accomplish it because you did the proper planning, or you just got through it, or whatever it was. But that's the night that I can't sleep. Is when that rush comes, like, yes, I did it. I pulled this thing off. And there's a lot of adrenaline associated with that deadline and that submittal.
It's that, for me, it's that sweet baby Jesus, it's done.
Yeah, totally.
On to the next project, right?
Exactly. Or it's, you've got the construction, you've got the documents out to bid, and, you're just like, big weight is lifted off your shoulders, and then you got to build it.
That reminds me of a time when I was in college, and I don't know how many units I was carrying and what all the details were, but it was after the crit. I came home middle of the day or late in the day, and I was just completely exhausted. And my mother called me, and so I'm sitting there on the couch, and this before we all had cell phones, and I'm talking on the phone. And suddenly I hear her saying, Neil. And I kind of wake up, and I'm like, huh? What? Oh, I literally fell asleep talking to her on the phone. And I just kind of said, Mom, I got to go lay down. That feeling that you're just so exhausted that you're completely spent, because you've given all you had to a project. And this was probably more in school, but it was just kind of a funny moment.
That's awesome. Well, I agree that I think one of the key components to working really hard and working on these deadlines is that you have your personal time, or your play time, or whatever it is, that gives your life a little bit of balance. So I think that's another topic for another day, but it's a huge part of working in this business is being able to completely leave work at work, if at all possible.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
although
so
I've never seen it.
You never seen it? I'm taking my kids to a trampoline house today. Have you guys heard about those things? It's a warehouse where the entire floor and the walls are covered in trampolines, and it was one of my boys' birthday yesterday, so I'm gonna go jiggle their bodies for a couple hours.
We're gonna probably go hang out with Van Gogh and Monet for a little while.
Nice, a little culture.
Yeah, a little bit.
We're going for culture of a different type. I think we're going to go to the comic book shop today. So
we need to talk about
this. That.
Yeah, we need to talk about this because, I think I have a couple of kids who are. I did some Christmas presents that were comic based, so this is going to have to be a future topic as well.
Well, absolutely, and then I can talk about my my current project too.
Yeah, fun, cool.
Sounds good.
Well, let's wrap this up. Again, everybody can go check out the links from the show at archispeakpodcast.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at Archispeak, ARCHISPK. And if you guys can leave us comments and ratings on iTunes, that would be great. Please subscribe to the show so it automatically shows up every time that it comes out. You don't have to do any work that way. And you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at eTroxel, ETROXEL.
And you can find me on Twitter at NPANN.
And you can follow me on Twitter as well at Archetype, which is ARCHY_TYPE.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Bye.
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 I joined the choir to sing. They're all competing for some other thing. I joined the choir to sing. I joined the choir to sing. They're all competing for some other thing. I joined the choir to sing.
One day